She thought she was humiliating a waitress in front of a packed restaurant. She had no idea she was destroying her boyfriend's entire empire in one breath. Vivian Kowalski put on a plain black uniform and walked into work like she always did. It was just a normal Friday shift at Villa Renata. Nobody in that restaurant knew who she really was. To them, she was just another waitress carrying plates and taking orders. But her life outside that restaurant was very different. Her husband's name made powerful men nervous. People didn't ask questions when he walked into a room. They simply listened. Vivian could have lived a life of comfort and never worked a single day. But she liked taking these small shifts. They reminded her who she was before all the money and power entered her life. They kept her grounded. That night, a woman named Paisley walked in with her boyfriend, Grant. Grant was a rising CEO, ready to close the biggest business deal of his career. Paisley wanted everything to look perfect. The moment she saw Vivian, she decided the waitress wasn't good enough for her table. She looked at Vivian's body and said cruel things about her weight, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Vivian didn't say a word back. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She simply stood there and took it, order pad in hand, calm on the outside. Grant laughed nervously beside her, more worried about impressing his business guest than stopping his girlfriend's cruelty. Nobody at that table understood what her silence really meant. But someone did notice. The restaurant manager saw her and went pale. He knew exactly who she was. He knew this wasn't just an awkward moment. He knew trouble was coming even if he couldn't explain why. Vivian finished her shift like nothing had happened. She smiled at other tables. She did her job well. But quietly, she was remembering every detail. Their names, their conversation about the upcoming business merger, and the careless way Grant had left his business card sitting on the table. That night, she went home and told her husband, Dominic, exactly what happened. She didn't yell. She didn't demand anything. She simply told him the story calmly, the way someone recaps their day. He listened without a word. Then he slowly nodded. That nod was the real beginning of everything. Not a threat. Not an argument. Just quiet understanding between two people who had seen the world underestimate people before. Paisley walked out of that restaurant believing she had won. She had no idea a countdown had already started. And nothing she did after that night could stop what was already coming. The kitchen at Villa Renata smelled like garlic and butter when Vivian clocked in that evening. She tied her apron the same way she had 100 times before, hanging her coat on the same hook near the back door. Nobody watching her would have guessed she owned half the buildings on the street through companies with names nobody could trace back to her husband. She liked this job for reasons she never bothered explaining to anyone. Long before Dominic, before people started lowering their voices when they said the name Kowalski, she had waited tables just like this. Back then it was survival. Now it was choice. There was something honest about carrying plates and remembering orders that her real life didn't offer anymore. Roland Pruitt ran the floor that night, and Vivian noticed how tightly he held his shoulders as he walked past the host's stand. A new hire dropped a tray of water glasses near the kitchen doors, and Roland flinched harder than the noise warranted. Something was making him nervous, though he hadn't said what. Vivian noticed things like that. It was a habit, not a skill she'd worked to build. She noticed the way two regulars at table 6 lowered their voices when she walked by, glancing at each other instead of her. She noticed empty wine glasses left too long, an argument brewing quietly at a corner booth, a couple pretending not to fight. People rarely saw her watching. That was the point. She checked the reservation list pinned near the server station out of habit. Table 12, 7 o'clock, under the name Grant Ashworth, party of 3. The name meant nothing to her. Just another wealthy man booking a table to impress someone. Restaurants like Villa Renata were full of men like that, chasing deals over expensive wine, convinced the night belonged to them. Roland found her a few minutes later, clipboard pressed against his chest like a shield. He hesitated before speaking, choosing his words the way people did when they weren't sure they should be asking at all. "You're sure you want section 3 tonight?" he asked. "I can switch you with Danny if you want something lighter." Vivian glanced at the list again, then back at him. There was nothing about the question that alarmed her. Restaurants were full of difficult customers, needy tables, people who complained about everything from the lighting to the ice cubes. She had handled worse than table 12 before, whoever they turned out to be. "I'm sure," she said simply, tucking her notepad into her apron pocket. Roland nodded, though something behind his eyes didn't settle. He walked away without explaining further, and Vivian didn't ask him to. The dinner rush was about to begin, and table 12 was just one more table on a long list waiting to be served. Grant Ashworth checked his watch for the third time in 10 minutes, sitting alone at table 12, running through his pitch in his head. Tonight wasn't just another dinner. If everything went well, Harlan Voss would sign off on the merger that could double the size of his company. He'd spent 3 months chasing this deal and tonight was supposed to close it. He straightened his jacket when he saw Paisley walking through the entrance. She moved like she expected people to look at her, and most of the time they did. Her heels clicked against the floor with a sharp, deliberate rhythm as she scanned the restaurant, her expression already tightening. "This place is smaller than I thought," she said, sliding into her seat without waiting for him to pull out her chair. "The lighting is terrible for pictures too. Couldn't you have picked somewhere with better ambience?" Grant barely looked up from his phone. "Harlan picked it. Said it's his favorite spot in the city." Paisley rolled her eyes but said nothing more, adjusting the strap of her dress and glancing around the room like she was mentally redecorating it. She hated when Grant chose business over her comfort, but tonight wasn't the night to push it. Not with someone as important as Harlan joining them soon. When Harlan arrived a few minutes later, Grant's entire posture changed. He stood immediately, shook his hand with both of his own, and thanked him for coming like he was greeting royalty. Paisley offered a polished smile, the kind she practiced for moments exactly like this, complimenting Harlan's watch before he even sat down. Grant spent the next several minutes making sure everything was perfect. He asked if Harlan wanted a different table, if the wine list needed adjusting, if the temperature in the room was comfortable enough. He barely noticed Paisley shifting in her seat, arms crossed, clearly annoyed that his attention wasn't on her. She wasn't used to being an afterthought. Usually rooms revolved around her, not around some investor twice her age with an expensive watch and boring stories about golf courses. She sipped her water in silence, letting her irritation simmer quietly beneath her calm expression. That's when Vivian approached the table, notepad in hand, asking politely if they were ready to order drinks. Paisley's eyes moved over her slowly, taking in every detail of her uniform, her frame, her calm and unremarkable presence. Something about her irritation from the ambience, and the doctor's dismissal, and the botched attention all needed somewhere to go. Paisley's expression shifted, her jaw tightening, her eyes narrowing the way they did right before she said something she wouldn't regret saying. Grant, still deep in conversation with Harlan, didn't notice the tension building beside him. Whatever calm had settled over the table a moment ago was about to disappear completely. Vivian stood beside the table with her notepad ready, waiting patiently as Paisley looked her up and down one more time. "I'll have the sparkling water," Paisley said, then paused, tilting her head like she just noticed something worth mentioning. "Actually, do you even recommend the pasta here? I mean, look at you. You'd know all about the pasta, wouldn't you?" A couple at the next table glanced over. Vivian kept her expression steady, her pen resting against the notepad without moving. Paisley smiled, pleased with herself, and kept going. "I'm just being honest. Someone should tell you these things. Confidence is great, but health matters too." Her voice carried further than it needed to, loud enough that 3 more tables turned their heads. Grant let out an awkward laugh, glancing at Harlan like he was checking whether this was funny to him too. He didn't say anything to stop her. He didn't tell her to lower her voice. He just wanted the moment to pass quickly so dinner could get back on track. Across the room, Roland froze mid-step, a tray balanced on his arm. His stomach dropped the second he realized what was happening at table 12. He knew exactly who Paisley was talking to, and he knew there was nothing he could say without giving away something far bigger than a rude comment. All he could do was stand there, helpless, watching a woman insult someone she had no idea she should fear. Vivian didn't flinch. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself, didn't even change her breathing. She simply stood there and let the words land, absorbing them the way she'd learned to absorb far worse over the years. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was control. But nobody at that table understood the difference. Paisley mistook the quiet for defeat. Encouraged by the lack of response, she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with satisfaction. "You know what, I don't think she's a good fit for this table," she said to Grant, loud enough for Vivian to hear clearly. "Can we get someone else? Someone a little more presentable?" The words hung in the air like they belonged to someone far crueler than Paisley realized she was being. Grant hesitated for half a second, glancing at Harlan again, then gave a small nod toward Roland across the room, silently agreeing to the request just to keep the night moving smoothly. Vivian lowered her notepad slightly, met Paisley's eyes for the first time since the conversation started, and nodded once. "Of course," she said calmly, her voice steady and unreadable. She turned and walked away without another word, leaving the table behind exactly the way she'd found it, except now the countdown had already begun. Vivian finished the rest of her shift without a single complaint. She moved between tables the same way she always did, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, thanking regulars by name on her way out. Nobody watching her would have guessed anything unusual had happened just an hour earlier. But her mind hadn't stopped working since she walked away from table 12. She remembered the investor's name the moment Grant said it out loud during dinner. Harlan Voss. She remembered the mention of the merger, the casual way Grant talked about numbers he clearly thought no one else was paying attention to. She remembered the business card he'd left carelessly near his water glass, the one she'd picked up along with the empty plates without anyone noticing. People rarely thought about what a waitress heard. That mistake had cost smarter men than Grant before. Roland caught her near the back exit as she was untying her apron. His hands were still shaking slightly from earlier, his voice lower than usual. "Vivian, I am so sorry. I should have said something. I should have stopped it before." "You didn't need to," she said, cutting him off gently without any edge in her voice. "Nothing happened here that needs fixing tonight." Roland stared at her, unsure what unsettled him more, the humiliation he'd witnessed, or how calm she seemed about it now. "Are you sure? Because if you want me to do something, say something to management, I'm sure," she said again, offering him a small, reassuring smile that somehow made him feel worse instead of better. She placed a hand briefly on his shoulder before grabbing her coat. "Go home, Roland. It's late." He watched her walk out into the night, more confused than relieved, wondering why her calm felt heavier than anger would have. At home, Dominic was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a folder of papers he wasn't really reading anymore. Vivian sat down across from him and told him about her night the way she always did, plainly, without exaggeration, without asking for anything. She described the comments about her weight, Grant's nervous laughter, Paisley's request to have her replaced. She mentioned the investor's name and the words merger and acquisition that had slipped out carelessly over wine. Dominic listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on her the entire time. When she finished, he didn't say a single word. He simply nodded once, slow and deliberate, the same way he nodded when a decision had already been made in his mind. Vivian didn't need him to say anything else. She already understood what that silence meant. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't anger either. It was the quiet, patient beginning of something that had already started moving, whether Grant Ashworth realized it or not. By the third day, Roland had convinced himself something should have happened already. He kept waiting for a sign, a phone call, a strange visitor, anything that confirmed his fear that Vivian's night at table 12 hadn't just quietly disappeared. Nothing came. No confrontation, no threats, nothing out of the ordinary. Somehow, that silence unsettled him more than any explosion would have. He caught himself checking the reservation book more often than usual, scanning for the name Ashworth without meaning to. He told himself he was being paranoid, that Vivian had simply meant what she said, nothing needed fixing. But 3 days of watching and waiting had worn down his ability to believe that fully. On Tuesday, the produce vendor showed up asking unusual questions about ownership, wanting to know who exactly handled Villa Renata's supplier contracts. Roland brushed it off as routine paperwork, though the vendor's tone felt oddly careful, like he was choosing his words. On Wednesday, a wine delivery got rescheduled without any real explanation, pushed back a full week for reasons the distributor wouldn't clearly state. Roland noted it, shrugged, and moved on with his day. Small inconveniences happened all the time in restaurants. He told himself these were just that. But by Thursday, the pattern started gnawing at him in a way he couldn't shake off anymore. 2 unrelated business contacts, in 2 unrelated conversations, had mentioned hearing things were shifting around certain deals in the city, without naming names or offering details. Roland wasn't part of that world. He didn't know the specifics of what Dominic Kowalski did, not really. But he knew enough. He knew people didn't talk about a man like that unless something was already moving quietly beneath the surface. He thought about calling Grant. He thought about it more than once, phone in hand, thumb hovering over contacts before pulling back each time. What would he even say? That his girlfriend had insulted the wrong waitress? That the wrong table had somehow drawn the wrong kind of attention? It sounded absurd out loud even in his own head. And worse, warning Grant meant explaining how he knew, which meant explaining who Vivian really was, something he had no right to reveal. Late Thursday evening, he found himself staring at the reservation screen again. Grant Ashworth. Table 12. Booked for a follow-up dinner with Harlan Voss, confirming the merger was still moving forward as planned. Roland's stomach tightened looking at it. Part of him wanted to warn Grant, just enough to protect him from whatever was coming. But another part of him, the smarter part, understood this wasn't his story to interfere with. He closed the reservation screen slowly, exhaled, and told himself there was nothing he could do. Whatever was coming had already started, long before he ever noticed the signs. Grant had started noticing small things that didn't quite add up. A shipment he needed for the new office expansion got delayed with no clear reason, the supplier offering vague excuses about logistics issues that never fully made sense. He shrugged it off at first. Delays happened. Supply chains were messy. It wasn't worth losing sleep over. Then came the call with his banker, someone he'd worked with for years, someone who usually picked up on the first ring. This time he got sent a voicemail 3 times in a row, followed by a short text saying he was tied up and would circle back soon. Grant frowned at his phone longer than he meant to, but told himself people got busy. Nothing about it felt urgent enough to chase. Paisley, meanwhile, was in a great mood. She told the story about the waitress to 2 of her friends over brunch, laughing about how she'd kept it classy, while putting someone overweight and rude in her place. Her friends laughed along, agreeing she'd done nothing wrong, that people needed to hear the truth sometimes. As far as she was concerned, the whole thing was forgettable, a funny story to tell over mimosas, nothing more. Grant didn't think about that night much anymore either. He had bigger things on his mind, namely making sure the merger stayed on track. When he met with Harlan later that week, he mentioned the small hiccups almost as a joke, expecting nothing more than a laugh in response. Harlan waved it off easily. Every deal has friction points, Grant. Don't read into it. This merger is solid. I wouldn't be sitting here if I had doubts. His tone was confident, reassuring, exactly what Grant needed to hear. That reassurance settled Grant's nerves more than he expected. If Harlan wasn't worried, there was no reason for him to be either. He drove home that night replaying the conversation, convincing himself the missed calls and delayed shipment were nothing but ordinary bad luck, the kind every growing company dealt with eventually. He didn't think about Villa Renata. He didn't think about the waitress Paisley had insulted, or the calm way she'd walked away that night without argument. He had no reason to connect a delayed shipment, a distracted banker, and one awkward dinner into anything resembling a pattern. But each disruption wasn't random. Every delay, every unreturned call, every quiet hesitation from people who used to respond instantly, was part of something moving steadily beneath the surface, deliberate and unhurried. Grant shook off his unease easily that night, unaware the ground beneath his empire had already begun shifting, one small crack at a time. Dominic's study had become quieter than usual, though the work happening inside it was far from small. He sat behind his desk with a single notepad, making calls one at a time, never raising his voice, never repeating himself twice. Nobody who owed him a favor needed to be threatened. A simple phone call, a familiar tone, a brief reminder of old debts was always enough. Vivian watched from the doorway sometimes, arms crossed, saying nothing. She'd seen this before, more times than she could count over the years. Men who trusted Dominic's silence far more than they'd ever trust his anger. He didn't yell. He didn't make promises about consequences. He simply asked people to reconsider certain decisions, and somehow every single one of them did. The banker who had ignored Grant's calls was one of the first to fall in line, quietly rearranging his priorities after a short, polite conversation with Dominic. The supplier delaying shipments had also, without much resistance, decided to slow things down even further, citing reasons that made sense to no one but him. None of it was loud. None of it looked like revenge from the outside. It simply looked like bad luck accumulating around one unfortunate man. Vivian understood the mechanics of it completely, the same way she understood weather patterns or tides. Nothing about it surprised her anymore. But there was a small, quiet moment that night where she paused, watching Dominic dial another number, and felt something flicker beneath her usual calm. Not guilt exactly. More like a memory resurfacing. The years before Dominic, when she was the one nobody took seriously, the one people spoke over, judged, dismissed without a second thought. She remembered what that felt like far more clearly than she remembered anger. And for a brief second, she wondered if this was really about Grant's carelessness, or about every person who had ever made her feel small before she learned to stop reacting to it. Dominic glanced up at her from his desk, phone still in hand, waiting silently for her nod before continuing. She didn't say a word. She simply nodded once, the same way he had nodded to her weeks earlier, understanding passing between them without needing language. He dialed the last number of the night. Harlan Voss picked up almost immediately, his voice friendly, unaware of who was calling or why. Dominic spoke calmly, briefly, choosing every word with precision, never once raising his tone or making a direct threat. By the time the call ended, Something in Harlan's voice had changed, quieter, more hesitant than before. Vivian watched Dominic set the phone down gently, the final piece now fully in motion. Nothing dramatic had happened. No shouting, no confrontation. Just a quiet conversation between two men, and somewhere across the city, Grant Ashworth's entire future had just shifted without him knowing it yet. Grant walked into the meeting room on day 21 with a signed folder tucked under his arm, expecting nothing but handshakes and congratulations. 3 months of work had led to this exact moment. But the second Harlan Voss looked up from the table, something in his expression felt wrong, colder than Grant had ever seen from him. "Harlan, good to see you," Grant said, extending his hand with practiced confidence. Harlan shook it briefly, without warmth, without his usual easy smile. "Grant, I think we need to hold off on this," Harlan said flatly, sliding the folder back across the table without opening it. Grant blinked, caught completely off guard. "Hold off? We agreed on everything last week. What changed?" Harlan avoided his eyes, choosing his words carefully. "Some things came up. It's not personal, just timing." He stood up before Grant could push further, gathering his things quickly, offering nothing more than a stiff handshake before walking out of the room entirely. Grant sat there stunned, the folder still sitting untouched in front of him. Within an hour, his phone started buzzing with messages that felt like separate pieces of the same collapsing puzzle. His banker's assistant called to inform him that the financing request had been formally withdrawn, no explanation given beyond internal review. His main supplier followed shortly after, canceling the remaining contracts outright, citing reasons that sounded rehearsed rather than real. By the afternoon, calls he used to get returned within minutes went completely silent. People who once picked up on the first ring suddenly became impossible to reach. Grant sat at his desk, staring at his phone, trying to understand how everything had unraveled in the span of a single day. When he told Paisley what was happening that evening, she brushed it off almost immediately. "This has nothing to do with some waitress from 3 weeks ago," she said, arms crossed, clearly annoyed he'd even bring it up. "You're overthinking this. Business happens. Deals fall apart all the time." Grant wanted to believe her. He wanted an explanation that made sense, one that didn't feel as unsettling as the timeline quietly forming in his head. He drove to Villa Renata that night, hoping Roland might know anything about why Harlan had suddenly gone cold. Roland hesitated when Grant asked, glancing around before lowering his voice. "Grant, do you know who was serving your table that night? 3 weeks ago?" Grant shook his head slowly, confused. Roland took a breath, choosing his next words carefully enough that Grant understood before the sentence even finished, that everything happening around him wasn't bad luck at all. Grant showed up at Villa Renata the following evening without calling ahead. He hadn't eaten all day, hadn't slept much either, and the only thought running through his head was that maybe, somehow, this could still be undone. He asked the host at the front if the woman who'd served table 12 a few weeks back still worked there. Moments later, Vivian stepped out from behind the kitchen doors, drying her hands on a cloth, unsurprised to see him standing there. "You came back," she said, not as a question, more as an observation. "I need to know what's going on," Grant said, his voice cracking slightly. "Everything is falling apart. My banker cut me off. My supplier's gone. Harlan won't even look at me anymore. Is this all because of what happened here?" Vivian folded the cloth in her hands and set it down on the counter beside her. "You're asking the wrong question," she said. "You keep asking what I did. You should be asking what you allowed." Grant opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. He thought back to that night, Paisley's voice getting louder, the way he'd laughed instead of stepping in, how badly he'd wanted the moment to just pass so dinner could continue. "I never planned any of this as punishment," Vivian continued. "You didn't attack me. You just stood there while someone else did because it was easier than making things uncomfortable for your guest. That tells people everything they need to know about you. So this is just over?" Grant asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's no fixing it?" "Some things don't need fixing," she said. "They just need time to finish playing out." There was nothing cruel in the way she said it. No triumph, no anger, nothing that resembled revenge the way Grant had imagined it. It felt more like watching a door quietly close, one he hadn't realized he'd been walking toward for weeks. He left without saying much else, driving home in silence, replaying the conversation over and over. When Paisley called that night, going on about weekend plans and a party she wanted him to attend, he barely responded. She had no idea her comment at dinner had cost him everything. She still believed without any doubt that she'd simply spoken an inconvenient truth that night, nothing more. Grant sat alone in his apartment long after her call ended, finally piecing together what Roland's nervous glances, Harlan's sudden distance, and Vivian's steady calm had meant all along. Back at the restaurant, Vivian finished locking up for the night. She stepped outside into the cool air, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders, and walked down the street like it was any other evening. Nothing about her pace changed. Nothing about her expression gave anything away. She simply moved forward, unhurried and unbothered, carrying the same quiet strength she'd carried the very first time someone made the mistake of underestimating her.